Well, first of all, I did want to talk about your book a little bit, Vijay. I mean, as somebody who comes from my family comes from the Caribbean, and I've done plenty of study with regards to the ways that NATO aligned countries will destabilize global South countries. My family's country included, Jamaica. I wanted to get a sense from you, based on the Manual for Regime Change chapter, what that generally looks like, because it kind of feels like we keep falling for the same okie doke over and over and over. And not only do we do that, like every single time that we're told that XYZ country is a danger to its neighbors or a danger to its own people, i.e., with regards to China, that China is engaged in a genocide of the Uyghur people, or that they're a danger to neighboring Taiwan, or that Russia is geared up for an invasion of Ukraine. And you find people like on the progressive left that keep falling for this shit over and over and over. And I feel like a crazy person when I try to explain to them, this is a tried and true manual. There is an actual technique by which they're able to not only manufacture the consent for foreign intervention, but recruit people who believe themselves to be progressives and even anti-war in some cases to go along with it.
Well, I want to say that in October and November 2019, there was a coup d'etat in Bolivia against the government of Evo Morales. Now, I just want to start there because even liberals should have objected to that coup. And the reason is that Evo had been elected to a term of office that was to have ended in January, February 2020. There was an election for the next term that began in January, February 2020. And the contest was about that election. Nonetheless, a military officer, General Williams Callin, walked into Evo's office and said, "Get out of town." This was in November 2019. So in fact, he was removed from office, not allowed to finish the term that would have ended in January, February 2020. If you understand what I mean, even liberals, constitutional liberals, should have been up in arms and say, okay, fine, he shouldn't have been re-elected. There was a problem there, but let him finish his term. No, they all celebrated, said he was trying to stay on too long. By the way, Angela Merkel sat in office as Chancellor of Germany longer than Evo Morales. But
so did Netanyahu. So did Netanyahu.
Yeah, so did Bibi Netanyahu. That doesn't bother anybody. But, this native man who improved the conditions of his population way more than anybody else had previously done in Bolivia, earned the love of his people, overthrown in a coup, and liberal, quote-unquote, periodicals across North America just going ahead and saying it's not a coup, it's a democratic process. Well, yes, Janet Áñez is a lunatic, but nonetheless, Evo Morales overstayed his fucking welcome. Who are you to judge whether he overstayed his welcome or not? So I was so pissed off that I sat down and in a month I wrote this book, little more than a month. Now, luckily, I've prepared to write this book for years because I've met, 100 ex-CIA agents, discussed with them their various, cloak and dagger shenanigans. I've read all kinds of reports. And I thought what I'm going to do in this book, which I basically wrote for young people, if you see, it's not written for scholars. I wrote it for young people. And then I thought, look, just like you were saying, Q, I know there's a bloody manual there. And I know that it's buried somewhere in Langley or it's, in some office somewhere in DC, in a nondescript office in a strip mall. There's a manual for regime change. And I'm going to reconstruct it from history. And so that's what I do. And it's important that the first point on the manual for regime change isn't send a US-trained general like Williams Callin into Evo's office, them to go. No. Long before the general moves, before, General Augusto Pinochet leaves, lets the tanks get out of the base in Santiago, long before then, you begin by lobbying public opinion. And, it should come as no surprise to anybody who looks closely at these things. There is what Francis Stoddard called the mighty Wurlitzer, from the days of the 1940s and 50s. The United States has used advertising techniques, mastered in New York City, used the highest form of advertising techniques to come out there and basically bewilder the public with their own way of framing reality. For instance, Russia is being aggressive. I mean, Biden, in a press conference on the 19th of January this year, said that after World War II, no country with nuclear weapons has ever invaded another country. This was Biden. He said this on the record at a press conference. And he said, therefore, Russia should not be allowed to invade Ukraine. Well, the Republican National Committee tweeted a correction and said, no, Biden is wrong. A nuclear-armed country has invaded another country since, World War II. And the example they gave is Russia invading Ukraine in 2014. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. That's amazing because Biden, you voted for the Iraq war. And, there's so much evidence of the United States, which last I checked, nuclear weapons country, so much evidence, so many different examples of the US having invaded other countries. What he said should have been challenged in the Washington Post editorial page if there were actually, journalists there, or in the New York Times editorial page, somebody writing and saying, well, look, United States nuclear weapons. But you see, everything rested there on the word invaded. And this is where lobbying public opinion and the information war is important. Invaded. You can only invade another country if the country doesn't belong to you, as it were. In that same press conference, Biden said, look, it's a bad idea. We shouldn't call Latin America a backyard. He said, Latin America is actually, and wait for this, you think he's going to say nobody's backyard. No. Biden is beyond that. Biden said, Latin America is not our backyard. He said it's our front yard, which is supposed to be the liberal improvement. But in fact, what he's saying is it's our yard. Either way, it's back or front, it's ours. They don't have sovereignty. So if the world doesn't have sovereignty, and this is the global Monroe Doctrine, if the world doesn't have sovereignty, you can't be invading anywhere. It's not an invasion. If the United States sends troops to Romania or to Ukraine, they're not invading anybody. They're just exercising their right to sovereignty over the planet. And this is completely established. Nobody, no eyebrow is lifted when the United States sends, big military deployments off the coast of China. Perfectly acceptable behavior. And that's the first thing that has to be done is you lobby public opinion. You say, this other guy is aggressive. This other guy is appalling and so on. And so what I did was I went from that all the way out, including, engineering mass protests in countries and so on. And there the example was from Guyana, where it's pretty stunning the role that the US labor movement played in the destabilization of the government of Chedi Jagan. Because the labor movement had trained labor organizers from Guyana. They were well paid, brought to New York, trained in the textile workers' office and so on. Then they returned to Guyana. And when the United States, when the CIA needed them, they basically said, bring out your unions on strike, don't negotiate. The situation was so bad that a British intelligence officer said, we shouldn't call it the AFL-CIO, we should call it the AFL-CIA. And so, I have these chapters of this, in the manual, there are these various things that need to be done. Military has to be sorted out and so on. I don't want to go through all of them. But what I want to say is every single of these operations starts looking so similar. So I decided to, as it were, reverse engineer the manual. And that's what's at the heart of the book. Because, boy, when Evo read the book, and he writes the foreword to it, but when he read the book, he said to me, wow, that manual of regime change, he said, everything is as it happened in Bolivia, not in the 1950s or 60s, but in 2019.
Hey, Vijay, just about the whole Evo Morales and Bolivia thing, it really raises a point for me that is really, I think, important. I made joking reference to the fact before that I'm on the call with two Marxists, which of course is true. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do a show with Q is because ideological differences do really matter. But when you said before, I'm interested in dismantling the capitalist system and reappropriating wealth, obviously someone not on the left is going to vehemently disagree with that and react strongly in a negative way. But so much of what we need to do is not about ideology, but dismantling propaganda and understanding the ways in which we're constantly being deceived by these information systems, by the CIA, by this manual that you're describing in your book. And all the time I see it, even though I focus on it and talk about it all the time, I see it more and more the more I do. So when right after that coup in Bolivia, like a month after, I flew to Mexico City where Evo had gone, and I did the first English language interview with him, or at least on video. And as I was interviewing him, I was thinking about the fact that what he's done in Bolivia is like a miracle. Not only did he lift huge numbers of people out of poverty and eliminate this enormous, inequality that has long plagued Bolivia on the basis of religion and especially race, but he did so in a way that didn't like scare international markets. Like even The Economist was publishing articles saying, he's a success story, which may or may not be a good thing. But sometimes in Latin America, that's what you need to do to survive. It's what Lula da Silva did in Brazil in order to survive and raise millions of people out of poverty, but also at the same time ensuring that enough of the financial markets weren't so against Brazil and alarmed by his radicalism that he was able to stay in office and do what he got done. And as I listened to Evo Morales talk and just like the sophistication with which he understood the world and the governing secrets he had developed that made his governing of Bolivia such a success, it occurred to me as someone who lives in Latin America, who writes about foreign policy in other countries for a living, how rarely I had heard from Evo Morales over the last 10 or 15 years, which is obviously by design. An incredibly popular and successful left-wing leader in Bolivia, the first indigenous person in Bolivia to ever be elected in a country filled with indigenous people. It's a remarkable story, and yet basically the media completely disappeared him. And the immediate, mainstream media narrative about what happened in Bolivia was that he got what he deserved. He was trying to steal a fourth term that he wasn't entitled to, even though a court ruled that he was that he was constitutionally entitled, that he committed election fraud, using very similar theories that Donald Trump ultimately ended up using in 2020, that these late returns coming in from the outer parts of Bolivia changed the results and enabled him to avoid a runoff. And I hope if anyone's listening who's considers themselves on the right or hostile to the left, I hope you'll go and watch that interview I did with Evo. It's on Evo Morales. It's on YouTube, because I think you'll find that so often we're trained to see the world through this metric of just nothing but ideology. And like I said, it matters. But so often it's about how we're propagandized and misled. And so much of what you said, Vijay, about your book and what you're writing, things about how people work clandestinely with the CIA and they co-opt things like labor movements. These are critical issues about how the ruling class operates that I think people ought to be interested in, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. And it's why I only want to talk to people who are situated in some way outside of the establishment and want to be outside of the establishment, whether on the right or the left or in some other heterodox way, because that's really when you begin to question it and begin thinking about the importance of understanding how you're being deceived all the time by that manual.
Well, you're right. And by the way, it is a terrific interview. I highly recommend it. But I also want to say that, yes, I am a Marxist and so on. But my principal identity with my work is I'm a journalist. And, I've traveled to many of the wounds of the world. I reported from Iraq, reported from Afghanistan, was there in Libya, traveled all across the wounds. And, in those open wounds, you really get a sense of how miserable power is and, how disreputable it is. And for all its claims to civilization, it does some pretty nasty things, grotesque things, doesn't allow people to breathe at all. So, when I look at the whole practice of intelligence and so on, it's frustrating because I'll give you an example. Recently, The Nation magazine wrote an article where the journalist decided to basically portray me as a genocide denier around the question of Xinjiang and so on. And, people are entitled to their opinion, I'm sure. But it was odd because in that article, he mentioned that I somehow am in favor of colonialism. Weird thing. That's an article in the Nation.
Vijay, just to interrupt so people know what we're talking about. We mentioned this article last week, Q and I did. It's in the Nation. It's by Dave Callin. It's about 3 weeks ago. And I think the title, Q, is something like what the left should do, what progressives should do about China or something like that, just for so people know what we're talking about. Go ahead.
In fact, I actually think it's called What the Left Should, which is curious because I don't know who's lecturing the left. There was also an article, I think on the same day, what the left should do about the Palestinian struggle and so on. So I didn't know the nation had taken responsibility to lecture the left on what it should do, but let's leave that aside. This gentleman essentially accused me of being in favor of colonialism and genocide. What was weird was that just a few months before that, the Nation editors had invited me to write an article where I wrote I thought, quite strongly against colonialism and against colonial wars, in particular Iraq, where I was reflecting on a conversation I'd had with some of my friends in Baghdad during the pandemic, and how much suffering the people of that country have endured, since Saddam Hussein first came to power in the 1970s, but certainly sharply since the sanctions period of the 1990s. And I've traveled many times into the country, talked to people and so on. And I thought that's bizarre. It's a mini information war. You're writing an article in a magazine, sort of saying that in an innuendo way that I'm in favor of genocide and colonialism, but your very editors just a few months ago invited me to write a piece where I wrote the opposite, and you can get away with it, you see. I guess the fact checkers didn't question it, they didn't query it, they didn't even Google their own website. It's that kind of thing. It's a lack of adherence to facts. It's where facts are easily whipped around by power, where you can say, look over here, don't look there. I very much believe in the importance of facts. I believe as a reporter, as a journalist, it's important to check stories, to go and talk to everybody. For instance, this week I wrote a story on the Amnesty International report about apartheid in Israel. Well, I spoke to Philip Luther, who has worked for over 20 years at Amnesty and was one of the key people who put that report together. Why was I interested in speaking to Philip? Well, because Yair Lapid, the foreign minister of Israel, had said when the report was out, doubt he read it, by the way, 280 pages, U.S. Ambassador Neil said it's an absurd use of the word apartheid. But anyway, Yair Lapid said something interesting. He said that the report quotes from terrorist organizations. Wow, that's a really, really harsh statement. That became the headline in many of the Israeli publications. Yair Lapid, foreign minister, says Amnesty International quotes from terrorist organizations. So I asked Philip Luther, well, how do you respond to that, Philip? That's interesting. Philip said, well, last year, the government of Israel essentially banned 6 Palestinian human rights organizations, calling them terrorist organizations. Well, it's true. The Amnesty report quotes from those human rights organizations. So if you don't look beneath the surface, don't ask, well, what does he mean when he says they quote terrorist organizations? Because it leads somebody to believe, oh, well, this is a Hamas report. And given the kind of overdetermination of what Hamas is, you don't have to think twice about what Hamas is. It discredits the report. And, adherence to facts is so important in the information war. And we have to just plug on, fight for it. I'll tell you this nation thing. It's interesting. I wrote a letter to the editor. I was told it'll be published, maybe 10, 15 days ago. It'll be published next week. It'll be published. It's never going to be published. That's not what they're interested in. Seems to me that some of these publications actually not interested in facts, in the truth. They are much more interested in playing the ideology game, the State Department game, being stenographers rather than journalists. Seems to me. What do I know? I don't have access to their level of powerful conversations. But from my position, they look like stenographers to power. And I find that to be extraordinarily, bad for people, bad for the way we are building something in the world. If you just come back to the Bolivia thing, they were all stenographers in that period. All of them writing things like, he's got to go and so on. And really, that struck me that not only do people not have the facts in hand, as I said, even a liberal constitutionalist would have said, forget the 4th term. Let him at least finish his 3rd term, until January, February. But the facts are irrelevant. They were set aside. And secondly, I thought entire generations are not being educated in simple things like the great history of coups that the United States has basically green-lighted to prevent countries in the third world in particular from exercising their sovereignty. And the coup that I remember as a child, which really impacted me greatly, not a child, as a teenager, was the coup against Thomas Sankara in 1987. In 83, when Thomas Sankara came to power in what was then Upper Volta, a country whose name comes from French colonialism, Sankara drove a really interesting people-first agenda. And one of the things he did was he changed the name of the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, which means land of upright people. It's a little bit like Mao Zedong's statement, China has now stood up, which is Mao's speech in 1949. Sankara drove a really good agenda for Burkina Faso. People of my generation, we were young students, we read about what they were doing, took real pride that, in the third world, a leader has emerged. Later, it would be somebody like Chavez, but this was Sankara. It's going to improve things, drive an agenda for the Sahel region of Africa. And in 87, he was assassinated. Oh, wow, big surprise. It's a cliche. Power operates in a cliched manner. But amnesia, the inability to transmit this knowledge one generation to another, allows power to continue its cliches, to keep doing this over and over again. 20, 30 years later, they'll release their papers in an act of democratic magnanimity. Look at this report. We overthrew the government of Mossadegh. But when a coup is happening at that moment, the power just says, no, this is not a coup. Well, 30, 40 years later, we'll release the report. Some intellectuals may read it. Nobody's paying attention. So we are democratic.
Yeah, and it's amazing that it's one of the most frustrating parts for me, what has happened in the Trump years is so much progress was made exposing how nefarious the U.S. security state is, the CIA is, the NSA is, and suddenly it's like all of that just got washed away by the combination of liberals being convinced that they were on their side in the fight against Trump, combined with historical amnesia on the part of huge numbers of people who only started paying attention to politics because of Trump and have no idea about any of the stuff you've just been talking about with the CIA and all the horrible things they've done in the world.